My name is Aaron DeVore. I'm the chair in Transgender Studies, and I welcome you to the next in our series of speakers and lectures on topics of interest to the trans community. So this event is taking place at the University of Victoria, and we like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And for those of you who don't know much about us, I wanted to take a couple of minutes at the beginning to tell you a little bit about who we are at the Chair in Transgender Studies.
The Trans Archive has been very much an eye-opener. The Trans Archive is very diverse, and it is such a rich body of work that is available.
Transgender Archive and training in Transgender Studies are a very special place for me. I hope every researcher about transgender have opportunity to come here. I don't have the same opportunity in Japan.
The experience has been great. Everyone was really friendly when I was corresponding to get stuff set up for my visit. I'm gonna miss it. I don't want to leave.
We have nothing but curiosity to lead us forward. So first of all, just breathe curiosity.
Okay, now on to the main event. So today, Mattie Walker is our speaker, and Mattie Walker is a PhD student in the Social Dimensions of Health program at the University of Victoria. Mattie is also a registered clinical counselor who specializes in supporting individuals who have experienced trauma and violence. So please turn your attention to Mattie, who will speak on supporting gender diverse survivors, exploring current approaches to trauma support for trans, two-spirit, and non-binary people who have experienced violence. So please welcome Mattie Walker.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. to talk today. I'm just going to adjust one other thing here. There we go. As Erin mentioned, my name is Mattie Walker. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Victoria in the Social Dimensions of Health program, and I'm also a registered clinical counselor, supporting individuals impacted by violence and trauma. I've been working in the anti-violence sector for about 10 years in a variety of settings, including transition homes, child abuse counseling and support, victim services, and sexual assault response. My current PhD research is looking at the idea of safety, particularly embodied safety, in the context of trauma support for gender diverse communities. And this presentation is part of the initial work I'm doing towards this research, and was part of how I came up with the questions that are guiding my PhD research. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, if you have questions along the way, I'm going to do my best to answer them and keep my eye on the chat. But if I miss your question, there's also opportunities to ask questions at the end as well. So let me just, there we go. So just a brief overview of the presentation today. I want to go over a little bit of the terminology, and then I'm going to move into context of violence, and then looking at some of the current evidence-based approaches for treating trauma and PTSD, identifying some of the gaps in the services, particularly for gender diverse communities. Then I'm going to be talking about the current review that I did for this presentation and as a starting place for my own research direction, identifying some of the frameworks that are in the literature, specific suggestions that are identified in the literature, and then looking at this idea of safety and areas of further inquiry. So the intention of this presentation is to raise some questions, identify what's currently available in the literature, and look towards future lines of inquiry that's guiding my own research and hopefully other research as well. So I would like to start by just saying that this is a presentation regarding trauma and violence, and some of the stats that will be shared can be upsetting or overwhelming. I like to make note of that at the beginning of the presentation because it's important to take care of ourselves when we're talking about topics like trauma and violence. Language is imperfect and often evolving, and so I'm using some terminology interchangeably, but also with the understanding that there's tension around usage of some of these terms. So I use the term survivor and then also people who've experienced violence. There's different opinions about using the term survivor, but I use it here in order to highlight the resilience and strength of gender diverse communities that are experiencing violence, but also knowing that some folks don't identify with that term. So I like to move between survivor and people who've experienced violence. I also talk about abuse, trauma, and violence. I use these three terms to describe various forms of violence, including physical, sexual, emotional, systemic, and institutional. I also use the term gender diverse as a large umbrella term to encompass many distinct and different identities and communities. I also use the term trans, two-spirit, and non-binary to describe three distinct but related experiences and identities. So when we look at context of violence, a disproportionate number of trans, two-spirit, and non-binary individuals experience violence in their lifetime. There's increased risk for victimization, threats of physical violence, experiences of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, bullying and harassment in schools, and homelessness. The gender diverse communities are disproportionately impacted by this and experience much higher rates than cisgender communities. Looking at some of the data that came out of the TransPulse Canada study, we can see that experiences of violence in the last 5 years are very high amongst trans, two-spirit, and non-binary communities. People have experienced 68% have experienced verbal harassment, 37% physical intimidation, threats. 16% physical violence, 42% sexual harassment, and 26% sexual assault. There's high rates of this violence and harassment amongst these communities. Just trying to get my slide to move. There we go. 1 in 3 trans and non-binary people in Canada had considered suicide in the past year, and 56% of trans and non-binary people in Canada reported that their mental health was only fair or that it was poor. 2020 was also considered one of the deadliest years for trans people in the United States, with a surge of violence and murders of trans people across the USA, with at least 40 trans people being killed. So with these contexts of violence and experiences of trauma amongst these communities, the need for effective support for these communities, for appropriate support, is very clear. And so I wanted to look at, well, what are we actually doing to support gender diverse communities? What are the current approaches? And how do we currently offer services to gender diverse communities who have experienced trauma? So looking at right now, what some of the current evidence-based practices are related to treating trauma or trauma symptoms, there's currently 3 primary recommended evidence-based approaches for treating trauma symptoms for the general populations. The first is cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on the relationship amongst thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, focusing on current problems and symptoms and looking to change patterns of behaviors and patterns of thoughts that have become unhelpful. So this might look like helping clients to challenge the meaning they may be making out of a traumatic event or beliefs about themselves that may be unhelpful. The second is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, also known as EMDR. This is a structured therapy that encourages the client to briefly focus on the trauma memory while simultaneously experiencing bilateral stimulation, typically eye movement. So this looks like working with a trained and skilled therapist that has special equipment to support with this bilateral stimulation. People also do tapping along with eye movement. This is associated with a reduction in the vividness and emotion associated with the trauma memories. And the final one is, can be considered a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's very specific to looking at exposing the person gradually to a specific trauma memory in order to reduce the response that's happening around this. So this can look like supporting clients to talk about the traumatic event and confronting their fears about it in a safe and supported context. There's also many other modalities that counselors use to support clients with trauma. However, these are the primary evidence-based approaches. Just to briefly mention, a practice or approach is considered evidence-based when there's a body of research that demonstrates that the practice has been investigated in a variety of populations or under different conditions and is still found to be effective. Other approaches are known as evidence-supported approaches, and they have a more limited body of research and are typically in the early stages of building evidence. So something like narrative practice or somatic therapy would be considered evidence-supported, but not specifically related to trauma at this time. So some of these evidence-supported approaches are similar and they adapt techniques from evidence-based approaches. So integrating a narrative approach into trauma work may look similar to CBT or prolonged exposure therapy, but might be focusing on different things like looking at meaning making or finding sites of resistance, response and strengthening the narratives about how the client made it through the traumatic event. There's also different social justice focused therapies, group therapies, solidarity groups, and community sport. But for the purpose of this presentation and what I was looking at, I was specifically looking at evidence-based practices because these are the primary ones that are recommended currently for supporting people with who have experienced violence and who have symptoms of PTSD or of trauma. So amongst these 3 different approaches, there's a few common strategies that are used. Some of them are called grounding techniques that support clients in regulating their stress response and helping them feel connected to their present reality. Experiencing traumatic events or violence can often disrupt a person's ability to stay in the present moment through experiencing flashbacks or being what people say triggered by certain things in their environment that bring back that trauma response. So people use breathing techniques, physical movement, noticing things around them, to help them ground and connect into the present moment and help them realize that they're no longer in that traumatic event. All of these techniques also recommend establishing a sense of safety. This isn't always clear how this is done, but often this is done through making sessions consistent and structured and predictable so that clients know what to expect and ensuring that the environment is quiet and safe feeling. These techniques also include psychoeducation about trauma and possible reactions. And there's a growing emphasis on understanding neurobiology and the connection between the brain, nervous system, and body, looking at how the system reacts under extreme stress and trauma. There's a growing and increased attention to body-oriented interventions alongside these evidence-based practices that look at how trauma work connects to the body out of solely talk-based therapies. So looking at the actual physical experience and connecting somebody back to their body. That's the terminology that's often used, is reconnecting somebody to their body. The goal of these approaches is to help the client to regulate their responses to the traumatic event in order to help them feel safe again. I wanted to make mention of this quote by Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the primary researchers and people developing approaches to treat complex trauma. And this is a line from the book, The Body Keeps Score, saying the single most important issue for traumatized people is to find a sense of safety in their own bodies. And so this is the rhetoric that is present right now in the field of treating trauma and supporting people who have experienced trauma. And I wanted to talk about this because when the context that we live in are steeped in racism, ableism, queerphobia, and transphobia, certain bodies are never safe under these systems. So the idea that we can return to a state of safety or have a sense of safety in our own bodies is really complicated. There's also this idea that safety is a resource that's located outside of somebody that exists and can be found and reconnected with, as opposed to that it must be like cultivated and built and understood in complicated ways. And this also suggests that clients can and will feel safe in their bodies and does not consider complex relationships with one's body and different experiences of embodiment or different experiences of dysphoria, particularly when we're looking at diverse experiences of gender. So some of the gaps in the services that I've noticed in my own practice and in my initial reading are that none of the current evidence-based therapies for trauma have actually been explicitly tested for use with gender diverse populations. There's also a lot of limited availability and accessibility to these services. Counseling is really expensive and often unaffordable for people. Many communities do not have access to services due to availability in their location, long wait lists, or ineligibility. And then typically community programs that offer counseling for a low fee or a no fee do this through funding and grants and must offer evidence-based approaches in order to be approved for funding. These evidence-based approaches like CBT are often offered in a limited number of sessions in these settings, as the evidence demonstrates that treatment can be effective in a certain amount of sessions, leading organizations to apply for funding and offer clients a limited amount of sessions, which can mean that the services end before the client is actually completed of their work. They're just using what they've been approved for. Clients have also had to educate their practitioners on their identities. So having to give a gender 101 education to your counselor before you're actually able to access trauma therapy or to be able to talk to your counselor. People talk about having invasive and unrelated questions. Clients accessing services for trauma are being asked inappropriate questions about their identities, their bodies, their relationships, their lifestyles. There's often a focus on transition or gender affirming care over trauma needs. However, at the same time, gender affirming care may be limited by requiring that trauma and trauma symptoms be resolved before they're able to access the care. And one of the largest gaps in all of these approaches, all these evidence-based practices, is the fact that they're supporting clients in ongoing contexts of violence. So most of these approaches are designed to support a client with a single traumatic event or a series of traumatic events that have since ended. These approaches often assume that an individual is now in a safer environment, that the traumatic context or event is over, and that the client will be able to return to a state of safety. So this gets really complicated when we're thinking about clients living in contexts of violence or living under systems that are violent towards them, or when violence and the threat of violence is part of their everyday experience. So support needs to look very different when clients continue to be in contexts of violence, and the support needs to be shifted to adapt to this. So with all of this in mind, this has led me to the questions that are guiding this current literature review. So I'm wondering, in what ways do the current evidence-based practices apply or not apply to gender diverse communities? What theories and frameworks are available for providing trauma support for gender diverse communities? And what are the current recommendations specifically for trans, two-spirit, and non-binary populations? So what I did was I did a literature review of the academic and peer-reviewed literature over a 10-year span, so from 2010 to 2020, using the keywords transgender, trauma, therapy, mental health, gender diverse, survivors of trauma, two-spirit, non-binary, and gender dysphoria. I selected 102 articles for review across disciplines in social work, psychology, counseling, public health, nursing, and child and youth care. And within these articles, there was 3 main frameworks that were offered to understand and support gender diverse people who've experienced violence. Intersectionality, minority stress model, and ecological systems theory. So intersectionality is a theory coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, originally developed in Black feminist legal scholarship, and it's taken up across disciplines and utilized to expose how single-axis thinking can undermine struggles for social justice, and it makes visible unique relationships between complex identities. It's helpful in understanding how systems of oppression and power interact, creating dynamics of difference that can lead to disparities in mental health. However, it's not designed to inform trauma-focused therapy. It was presented as a framework for understanding contexts of violence and understanding the situations that individuals and communities are in. The second was the minority stress model. This was introduced by Meyer in 1995 and then adapted in 2003 to conceptualize how health of sexual minority people is adversely impacted by different levels of stressors. It was then expanded by Hendricks and Testa in 2012 for gender diverse people's health. It's helpful in defining how experiences of stress, stigma, and discrimination combine to increase negative mental health symptoms. And it's helpful in understanding mental health disparities as well as differences in positive health outcomes amongst different communities. It also explores coping and social supports and the impacts on health outcomes. Again, this isn't designed to inform trauma-focused therapy. It's a model that helps us conceptualize and understand stress and contexts. The third framework that was offered across the literature is the ecological systems theory. This was developed by Bronfenbrenner in 1979, and it's helpful for understanding individuals' relationships within their communities and contexts in wider society. Defines how different systemic levels of an individual's context impact their experience, and it's helpful in naming how different systems of power or oppression may impact an individual's experience. Again, it's not designed to inform trauma-focused therapy, but it offers an understanding of context. So with these being the primary frameworks that were available across the literature I reviewed, I asked, well, what are these frameworks helpful for, and what do they actually help us with? They help us understand contexts of violence and what is leading to experiences of violence. They look at intersections of identities, so looking how stress might be compounded or understood differently through multiple forms of oppression, different experiences of oppression, and different access to resources. And they're very important for helping us not individualize the problem. So each of these frameworks helps situate the problem or the violence or the trauma that's occurring as outside of the individual and something that's happening within the context because of systemic issues. It also helps us understand that the trauma response is a necessary and probably expected reaction to living in adverse situations. So some of the specific suggestions outside of these frameworks that were present in the literature were establishing a sense of safety. This was across many of the different articles. Again, it's unclear exactly how this is to be done, but it was offered as a very important starting point for any sort of intervention or support strategy. Many of the different articles suggested using evidence-based approaches. However, as I mentioned earlier, evidence-based approaches have not specifically been explored as useful for gender diverse populations as of yet. And we can see some of the concerns or complications of how these evidence-based approaches might be useful or not useful for these populations. There's also a suggestion to assess and address multiple types of violence, so understanding multiple and ongoing contexts of violence. This was a large emphasis across the literature, and that there's multiple and ongoing contexts of violence. But again, the suggestion of how do we actually provide effective support for individuals and communities living in ongoing sites of violence is unclear. One of the things that really stood out as a concern, as it was a specific suggestion, was to prepare clients for possible difficult interactions with health and mental health practitioners. So it was found across several articles, and it's disappointing or concerning to see that one of the recommendations is that we should expect that mental health and healthcare practitioners are not actually prepared or educated to provide effective and appropriate support to communities that have a clear need for effective support for trauma and violence. I'm wondering why a recommendation might not have been framed as ensuring practitioners have education and are practicing from an approach of respect and dignity for trans and two-spirit and non-binary clients. So what is missing across this are specific strategies. So what do we do about these contexts and experiences of violence, and how do we actually support gender diverse clients? How do we consider unique needs? How are the unique needs of gender diverse communities being considered? And how can service recommendations move beyond suggesting that practitioners should start from a place of using correct names and pronouns for their clients, but actually move towards effective and appropriate support? And how do we support clients to feel safe when they continue to live in unsafe and violent contexts and systems? How are these approaches that the evidence has shown to be effective for some populations, maybe not effective in the ways that we need them to be for communities that live in ongoing sites of violence and under systems that are violent? And does our definition and approach to safety need to be adapted and re-understood? So this leads me to my main area of interest, which is what is safety. This is leading the direction of my PhD research, and it stood out to me across all the different articles that there was this recommendation to establish a sense of safety without a clear idea of actually what is that and what does it feel like. So I raise these questions as things that have been standing out to me of areas that we need to be looking into and that I hope to continue to explore. So what is safety? How does this look and feel different for different people, communities, and contexts? What does a felt sense of safety mean? So what does feeling safe actually mean? What does it mean to feel safe in your body? How is safety complicated by complex relationships with one's own body? How can we establish safety in a support context? Is it ever possible to actually do that? And how do we create safe enough experiences for people accessing services? And then what's our goal when we're supporting individuals who have experienced trauma? Is our goal to help them to return to a sense of safety they previously had? Or is it to access safety that's a resource outside of them, or to build and cultivate their own understanding and feeling of safety? Do we need to reconceptualize what the idea of safety is when we're creating goals and providing support? So some key areas of further inquiry that I identified through this literature review is, again, understanding safety. What does supporting a sense of safety for gender diverse clients look like beyond inclusive forms, correct pronoun use, cultural knowledge? Integrating the needs of gender diverse communities with evidence-based approaches. How can specific needs of gender diverse clients be integrated into current approaches to adapt evidence-based practices to be more applicable? And how do we adapt body-oriented approaches when there's a growing trend towards looking at the impact of trauma on the body? How can we adapt these approaches and shift them when we consider varied or different relationships with the body?
Great. Mattie, thank you very much. Really inspiring and thoughtful work, and I'm looking forward to having you speak again in a year or two when you have some results from your PhD, and I'm sure we'll have a great audience then as well.